So welcome to our webinar with Jeremy Deeds today. Thank you to our sponsor, CD3. CD3 is a boat cleaning system, and it's a standalone system. It has a lot of really cool tools. I saw it demonstrated a couple years ago in New Hampshire. There's several of them operational in New Hampshire, none that I know of yet in Maine, but please check out their website, cd3systems.com. Hopefully you saw some of the videos running while you waited for this webinar to start. So please take a look, and we thank them for their sponsorship. All right, today's speaker is Jeremy Deeds. He's an aquatic ecologist with the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. He has been there since 2014. He's worked on water quality projects in the northeastern U.S. over the past 20 years and has built extensive relationships that has allowed him to share research ideas and do a lot of things across the region and with different people and different agencies, which has been great for Maine. Jeremy is a native Mainer. He grew up fishing and boating on the lakes of Maine, and he feels very lucky to work on studying and helping to protect them. At DEP, he studies various aspects of Maine's lakes, including the measurement of changes in water quality over time and the role of shoreline development and shallow water habitat quality. He lives in Thompson with his family, who all enjoy getting out on the water as much as possible. And I know you'll enjoy Jeremy's talk. He is always entertaining and makes all of his topics very interesting. So with that, and hopefully no more glitches, I'll hand it over to Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Susan.
Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. Where is my screen? I think you need to give me control, Susan.
Okay. You should have control. I did stop sharing mine. This is the day for glitches. What is it telling you?
There it is. Okay.
All right. Take it away.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you all again for tuning in today. As Susan said, my name is Jeremy Deeds. I am an aquatic ecologist with the Lakes Assessment Section at Maine DEP. And the project I'm going to talk about today has to do with putting lakes into groups to help put lake data into context and how improve how we do our lake water quality assessments. So one of the core functions of our group, of our lake assessment section at DEP, is to do lake condition assessments. Basically a report card for every lake. How is it doing? Is it getting better or worse? What do we know about it? Within doing the lake condition assessments, it's really important that we know what the expected condition is. We need to know how to put the data into context and what each lake should look like so that we can make a more informed assessment. But so before we get into this particular project, I want to talk about this expected condition and how important it is to manage expectations. So what to expect is an important thing to think about. These three items on the screen right now, they have some similarities and some differences. You might say key similarities and important differences. So they're all vehicles of some sort. They all have wheels. They have other commonalities such as seats, steering wheels. They can transport you from one place to another. But there's some pretty important differences that are important to know about if you're going to use them. The key differences might be speed, the amount of cargo they can hold and carry, the utility of the vehicle. So for example, the truck and the lawnmower might be slow, slower than the sports car, but you necessarily wouldn't haul gravel with a Ferrari or cut grass with a dump truck. So appropriate expectations are important with vehicles and also with lake assessment. So here are a bunch of Maine lakes. So there are thousands of Maine lakes, and they're all unique, but they all have differences as well. So some of the similarities among these lakes, you can paddle, boat, swim, and fish in all of these lakes, but there are some important differences among them. There's differences in condition and potential condition. So the potential condition is what we would expect from the condition of each lake. So to be able to evaluate the condition of all these lakes fairly, we need to know what the conditions should be like. What are the expected conditions? Which ones are Ferraris and which ones are lawnmowers? So that's what we're going to try to get at. We're going to try to put these lakes into categories that help us make more informed assessments. So let's talk a little bit about lake condition and the things that affect it. So we know that human land use has a profound impact on lake condition. You know, this is something that we all think about every day almost, or at least I do. Human alterations in the watershed and land use in the watershed greatly affect the lake condition. This is true along the shoreline, and it's true in the larger watershed as well. As land is converted to lawns and residential areas, urban areas, agriculture, all those changes have an effect on the lake. The amount of wetlands and forests that are left in the watershed have another impact on the lake. And those are all human-induced changes. But there are also characteristics of watersheds, let's call them natural or background conditions, that have a more natural effect on watersheds. And these are things like watershed geology. In geology, there's differences in soil types that have an influence on lake condition. So this would be things like particle size, the nutrient content in the soils, and how erodible those soils are, how easily are they washed away and into the lake. The hydrologic connectivity of lakes and watersheds. Now, this would be a measure of how easily water is transferred from lake to lake, from rivers and streams to wetlands to lakes, and how much material that water that's transferred is able to carry with it as it goes towards the lake. And then there's lake morphometry. And that basically is the measurements of the lake and how deep it is and how large it is. All of these things affect lake conditions. Some of them are changed by humans and some are natural features of the landscape. What we want to do is tease these factors apart to learn more about what makes lakes work. So with all of those different influences, we have this sort of network of potential influencing variables. What we want to do with a classification like this is cut through the noise. So eliminate, variables that are related, variables that are not as important as others, and key in on a small number of variables that give us a number of categories that give us the most information about the groups of lakes that the classification generates. So how did we go about doing this? We started with geographical groupings. So these are existing land classifications across the state that allow us to put lakes in groups based solely on where they are in the state. So these are different watersheds, different geology types, and then things like ecoregions, which are areas of similar geology, soils, climate, and vegetation, kind of an all-encompassing land classification. And then on top of that, we layered lake depth categories and lake size categories. So with all these different combinations, we could then run some tests to figure out which grouping, which classification gave us the most information. So what we're looking for is groups of lakes where the differences among lakes are minimal and the differences among groups are great. And there may be one or two of you out there that care how we did that. So I'll just mention that it was a technique called linear mixed effects modeling. And it just helped us find the most informative, strongest statistical grouping of these variables, which we abbreviate with HGM, which stands for hydrologic, geologic, and morphometric variables. And we measured the strength of these groupings based on water quality variables that are key to how we assess lake condition. Number one was total phosphorus, which is a measure of lake nutrients and the biological productivity of a lake. And the second was specific conductivity. This is a measurement of ions in the water. And we use this because it is an indicator of residential or urban development in the watershed. And it has to do with, mainly with road silt. But there can be some natural conditions in watersheds that will affect the connectivity as well. But these are two important lake condition variables that we use that measure two different things. So what we found was that the lakes were best grouped into 3 geographic areas here in the map on the screen, and then stratified into 2 classes of shallow lakes and deep lakes. So the differentiation between shallow and deep lakes was a maximum depth of 10 meters or about 33 feet. And I'll get to that, why that's important in a minute. But what we have are so like I said, 3 geographic areas with shallow and deep lakes in each. So a coastal region with shallow and deep lakes, deep and shallow lakes, an inland region, and deep and shallow lake and a northern region. So first, let's talk about why lake depth was an important variable. So like I mentioned before, what we wanted to do was find variables that gave us an appropriate number of groups while incorporating a lot of information. So lake depth is one of those variables because it has so much to do with so many other variables that are important to lakes. So lake depth has an influence on water temperature, how cold the water can maintain through the year, the dissolved oxygen in a lake, how much the lake can retain or lose throughout the year, the residence time, which is the length of time it takes a lake, the water in the lake to be completely replaced with new water from the watershed. Lake depth has to do with the dynamics of lake mixing, how often it mixes, whether it stratifies or not. It has to do with light availability, which is important for how much light can reach the bottom of the lake, and also how much light gets through the water column. And also, and very importantly, lake depth has a lot to do with nutrient processing. Deeper lakes can assimilate more nutrients like phosphorus before it has a measurable change in the lake. So lake depth is one of these variables that is related to a lot of other important variables, and then therefore makes a good classification variable. Now let's talk about these regions and why these came out as important. So the northern region of Maine, and by that I mean what is on the map there. And I don't recall if I mentioned that these geographic regions are based on ecoregions. So remember, those are different areas that are share similar geology, similar soils, climate, even land use and vegetation. There's a lot of similarities within each ecoregional unit. So what we're dealing with here in the northern area is a presence of calcareous bedrock, so like limestone. That's important because calcareous bedrock is easily erodible, and it also leads to higher alkalinity in surface waters like lakes. So alkalinity relates to a lake's pH, so the acidity of the lake, and it also relates to the ability of the lake to resist changes in pH. A lot of animals don't do well with changes in pH. They can live at a certain acidity, but they can't go fluctuate very much. So alkalinity has a lot to do with the species that can live in a lake. It also has to do with the productivity of a lake. You know, there's a lot of fertile soils in this section of Maine, which means that once those fertile soils get into the lake, they can really increase the productivity of the lake as well. As far as land use, there's a pretty wide range of some intense agriculture in the eastern part of this area and some remote wilderness in the western part. And not a lot of in between, not a lot of middle ground in this area. So that makes sort of an interesting land use situation up in this area. The inland section, the soils in general, these are, broad generalities, but the soils are acidic and loamy and some are poorly drained. Poorly drained soils matter because the longer the water is in contact with the soil particles, the more nutrients and materials and minerals it extracts from the soil and then carries into the lakes. This area of Maine is also largely undeveloped. This sort of misses all the major population centers and is largely pretty remote, which is important for how we look at watershed condition for these lakes specifically. And then there's the coastal region. So geologically speaking, this area is unique because of the prevalence of this presumpscate formation, which you may have heard about in other talks about lakes in Maine. So this formation is marine-derived clays. So this red overlay is what's the marine limit, which would be the extent of the land that used to be underwater after deglaciation about 15,000 years ago. And this is important because those marine waters deposited this layer of nutrient-rich clay that's also highly erodible. Now this is, so what that means is that the soil is very fertile and good for growing agriculture, good for growing crops and agricultural land. So it's good for agriculture, but it can be bad for water quality if those soils are managed poorly. So lakes in this area have a greater potential of having advanced biological productivity. So this is, the coastal area is also, since it covers the entire coastline and all of the population centers, has the most development in Maine. So the most watershed pressure from human changes and development. So that's a basic rundown of how the classification was generated and why. For the second half of the talk, I'd like to talk about a couple different ways we are applying this classification and how we can use it to help inform our assessments and advance our knowledge about lakes in Maine. So first I want to talk about how the classification can influence our expected conditions based on watershed land use. And then I want to talk about how we can use this as a tool to shape our expectation of how lakes change over time when we're looking at water quality trends. So here are two lakes from two different areas. We have Brandy Pond in Naples and then Schoodic Lake in Brownville. Now, the land use pressures in these two lakes are very different. So in southern Maine, there's a lot more people. There's a lot more pressure on lake shores and lake watersheds. Up in northern Maine, the pressure isn't as great. There are not as many people, and the interaction with the lake is different. So in an example like Brandy Pond, there's shoreline development, there's houses and camps along the shore, but there's also golf courses and commercial development and marinas and different things in the watershed. In a lake like Schoodic Lake, there may be some camps along the shore and some forestry in the watershed, but the land use pressures in the watershed between these two ponds are very different. So it's not really a fair comparison to look at a developed lake in the coastal region and compare it to a developed lake in the inland region, because the development types and extents are very different. So what we can do with the classification is set those apart and look at it separately. So we can measure the amount of developed land in a watershed with GIS, with computer mapping. So here we have on the left, picture no developed land, and all the way on the right, all undeveloped land. And the scale bar in the middle has to do with the percentage of undeveloped land in the watershed, with undeveloped land obviously being better for lake water quality. If we apply this scale, or look at our 6 different categories of lakes, types of lakes along this scale, you know, if in a simple world, each lake type would have lakes that go all the way from 0% undeveloped land all the way to the other end of the spectrum at 100% undeveloped land. If that was the case, then we could make some cutoffs, and then we could easily define which lakes were in the worst watershed condition, which lakes had the best watershed condition, and then which lakes were in the average, had an average condition. And that way we would kind of know what to expect. But we know that's not the case, because the development pressures are different among these lake types and among these different regions of Maine. So it's not going to work. So since we know that they're different, we can take a look at the lakes in each lake class, and then we can look and see where the lakes in each lake type fall on the spectrum of watershed development. So now we can take the same percentages, say 25% of the watersheds in poor condition, and then 10% of the lakes that are in the best condition. And then even though they fall in different points along that scale from 0 to 100, we can still get a good portion or a good representation of good watershed condition, heavily changed watershed condition, and then a medium average condition. So that intermediate condition is going to be sort of the expected water quality or expected lake condition, what's in the middle there. And since that's different, it's different for every lake type, but now we have a way to look and see how it's different and how we can measure it for each lake type. So let's explore that a little more. What we can do with those cutoffs from the previous slide is apply those watershed conditions to the lake water quality data. Now we have thresholds for phosphorus and conductivity for each lake type, given the amount of watershed disturbance that's unique to each lake type. So now we're not comparing watershed development in southern Maine and trying to find lakes in northern Maine that have this similar watershed development and change, because it's not a fair comparison. Now we're comparing similar lakes to similar lakes, and we don't have to compare lakes that are not as similar. Instead of getting bogged down in all these numbers, what I want to do is pull out a couple of examples and work through some lake assessment with you. So here, let's consider 3 lakes, lakes A, B, and C. Lake A has a total phosphorus value of 12.6, Lake B is 13.9, and Lake C is 8.2. Now, if all we know about these lakes, and the only information we have is their phosphorus value, we see that Lake C is the lowest, so that means it has the lowest biological productivity. Lake B is the highest, and Lake A is somewhere in the middle. So we might be forced to make the assessment that Lake C is doing the best, Lake B is doing the worst, and Lake A is somewhere in the middle. It's not a very informed assessment. However, if we can apply these categories, and Lake A is a coastal deep lake, Lake B is a coastal shallow lake, and Lake C is an inland deep lake, now we have some more context. We know a little bit more about these lakes, and we can put these data into context and understand a little bit more what's going on. So now this graph shows the range of phosphorus values in these 3 different types of lakes for the 3 different condition categories. So the green parts of the bar indicate the phosphorus values for lakes that have minimally disturbed watersheds, so most natural. The red portions of the bars indicate lakes that have the most disturbed watersheds. And the white numbers inside the bars indicate the phosphorus values that go along with those thresholds in those different condition categories. So now we can take a look at these 3 lakes and their phosphorus values, and we can put them in the context of the other lakes of similar type. And now we see that even though the phosphorus values differ among these lakes, they are right where they are quote unquote supposed to be. They meet the average condition of what we'd expect for these lakes. So they meet that expected condition. The flip side of that is if the lakes don't meet that expected condition. So here we have 3 different lakes. They are still of the same type, but they are different lakes to look at with different phosphorus values. So let's take them one at a time. The CDL lake, the coastal deep lake, this lake has a phosphorus value of 16. That puts it a little bit higher than what is expected. So that would be a red flag. We would take a look at that and say that phosphorus value is a little high for this lake type. Let's take a closer look and see what's going on there. The coastal shallow lake is at 16, but that's still within the expected range because coastal shallow lakes are expected to have a little bit higher phosphorus values on average than coastal deep lakes. Even though they're in the same geographic area, we expect shallow lakes to have a little bit more phosphorus in them, or the concentration of phosphorus to be greater than deeper lakes, even of similar lake region. And the IDL, the inland deep lake, with the phosphorus value of 4, is pretty low, and it's even below the threshold for what we say a reference lake, or that minimally disturbed watershed. So that gets the gold star. So while the coastal deep lake was a higher phosphorus value, a red flag, and would then become a priority for a closer look and maybe some restoration or rehabilitation, a lake that's on the lower ends, like the inland deep lake with a low phosphorus value in the reference lake range, that lake might be a candidate for preservation or conservation if opportunities for that type of activity were available. We'd have some criteria for why it would be important to conserve a certain lake or a portion of a watershed if we were able to. So just to kind of recap this land use portion, this example was about 3 lakes, but what we can do now is when we have to expand our assessment to hundreds of lakes, we have these predetermined groups through this classification, so we automatically have some context to place the groups in. That allows us to do better assessments, more informed assessments, because we have a better picture about what is expected from each of the different lake types. Okay. So the second application I wanted to talk about was how we can use this classification to help refine how we do our assessments on lakes as they change over time. So a big portion of our assessment has to do with looking at time series, or how lakes are doing over a number of years. So this graph indicates median Secchi values for each year going back from 1990 all the way to 2018. The blue dots are the median values per year, and the black line indicates a moving average. So you can see that the values go up and down a little bit, but it's generally stable overall. What we can do now, so we have a set of reference lakes, and we use the term reference because we can use those minimally disturbed lakes as a reference as to what the expected condition should be. So we can take the set of reference lakes from each lake type and then put together a time series of data from those lake types to see what the lakes were doing over that same time period if they didn't have a lot of watershed development in them. So the graph on the bottom of the page is the same setup with years along the x-axis on the bottom, and then the Secchi values for each year, for each, the median Secchi values for northern lakes in each year in black dots, and then the moving average is the purple line. So we can see this also goes up and down a little bit, but overall it's been increasing over this time period. And so we can do this for every lake type, and we can see some different patterns emerge. So this is important because what this allows us to do is tease out signals that may be from watershed observation from human development in the watershed, or changes in the watershed due to human activity. In theory, if we have these minimally disturbed watersheds, the changes that we see in water clarity and lake condition over time would be due to more natural background factors like climate, and how precipitation can change water clarity year to year and over time. So by using these reference trends, these reference expected conditions over time, we can tease out factors that would be due to other things. Let's go through an example. So here's the Secchi data from the first slide I showed you. So the blue dots are the annual median Secchi disk transparency in meters. And then the line going through here would be the moving average. So again, it's up and down. It's kind of oscillating a little bit. Overall, it's pretty stable. Well, let's compare this to what the reference lakes for this lake type were doing during the same time. So here's the dotted line would be the time series, the reference trend for these are coastal deep lakes. So the reference lake with a little bit higher, a little bit deeper Secchi reading, which is fine. It doesn't really matter if it's higher or lower. What matters is how it's changed over time. So what we want to do is take the distance from the dotted line, the reference lake line, to those yearly median values. Now what we have are those vertical dotted lines, which we'll call residual values, because we're measuring the difference from the reference line, from the reference lake. Now this is pretty jumbled. It's hard to really see what's going on. So let's flatten out that dotted line, the reference line, and make that 0. And now what we can do is do a new trend analysis and see how the lake is changing over time as compared to the reference lakes. And so what we saw in the beginning was this lake had a generally stable trend over time. But when we compare it to the reference curve, the reference trend over time, it's getting lower over time. We're seeing a further departure incrementally over time compared to the reference lake. Now, this won't change how we do our trend assessments for lakes. If we're not going to say that this lake has a declining trend automatically if it meets this condition. What this does, it gives us another way to look at lakes, another way to do the assessment, another piece of information to help us tell the complete picture of what's going on with individual lakes. So to sum up, the lake classification is to help us define and refine what the expected condition is. The point is to have a little bit more information going in so we know, you know, are we dealing with a Ferrari or a lawnmower or maybe a dump truck? You know, what should this look like? How should it respond to its watershed? How should it respond to things going on in its watershed? So this context, having this context of what the lake should be like, is helpful for evaluating this lake data, whether it's for an individual lake or for all lakes over time. Knowing what to expect and having a good idea of what to expect is helpful for making an informed assessment. So what this really does, it adds more tools to our toolbox. It just gives us more information. It's a way to glean more information out of the data that we do have. So if you are interested in reading more about this work was published last year in Lake and Reservoir Management. Please do feel free to contact me if you'd like, and I'll make sure you can get a copy of this paper. It is in the works or in the plans to do a more user-friendly, publicly accessible report or some sort of informational thing about this, so that it'll help people understand what it is and then use it for their own lake assessment needs. And with that, I will leave you with my contact information and be happy to take any questions that there might be out there. Thank you very much.
Hey, Jeremy. Thank you so much for walking through that. I love to classify things and organize things, so it really appealed to my sense of wanting to do that. So it's really interesting, and I can see a lot of, you know, a lot of uses down the road in terms of helping people understand their lakes, and like you said, put it in context so that they're not jumping to conclusions maybe when they shouldn't be. So there's so far just one question, but hopefully a few more will pop up here as we chat. Everybody should feel free, use the Q&A button to ask anything you want of Jeremy.
Well, there is one more thing that I didn't actually get to in the presentation, and it's that we're able to do studies like this because of all the data that have been collected over the years. I mean, for example, that lake I showed at the end has yearly data from 1990, you know, and we can get to a lot of lakes in a year, but we can't get to all of them. And
yeah,
having the volunteer effort that's in Maine, and a lot of people on this webinar are probably lake volunteers as well, I would imagine. So now that we have this amazing data set, we can do a lot with it. And this project is one example of, you know, beyond just basic monitoring, what we're able to do with such a long-term data set that we have because of the history of volunteer lake monitoring in Maine. So we're only going to be building it out from here. So it's, for someone like me that gets to work with it, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and so if anybody is interested, Lake Stewards of Maine, and I think it's lakestewardsofmaine.org is we collaborate with them on a lot of other projects, but they're the ones to visit if you're interested in becoming a lake water quality monitor. They train people and they do an amazing job of collecting this data, like Jeremy said, that's so useful and has so many uses for so many aspects of lake science. All right, somebody would like to know, and I don't know what this acronym stands for, but hopefully you do. How does this analysis relate to the LVI?
Lake Vulnerability Index, maybe?
Maybe. It's an anonymous attendee, all right?
Okay. Okay.
Ask them more.
If that's the case, it relates to the vulnerability index is the idea that there are certain aspects of lakes, both in the basin and in the watershed, that make them more vulnerable to eutrophication or alteration. And this is part of it, in that it may be that lakes are more or less vulnerable to different aspects based on their lake condition, based on their watershed geology, based on other conditions like lake depth or lake size. So yeah, we are, you know, in the process of revisiting of that, because we're getting a lot more information than we had the first time that the Lake Vulnerability Index was done. So it's a building block approach for sure.
Got it. Somebody asked about the depth, how you measure depth, if it's overall, average overall depth or the deepest spot when you talk about.
I didn't mention that. It is based on maximum depth.
Okay, so the maximum depth
Maximum
over
depth.
33 or under 33.
Yeah, 10 meters
Okay.
or 33, yeah. And that comes from the overall average of Secchi depth in Maine, at least with this data set, is about 5 meters. So double the Secchi depth is what's called the photic zone, which is where light can reach. So it's different for every lake, but that was just kind of the categorization that worked the best here.
Got it.
So.
Okay. What percentage of Maine lakes in the coastal area have been classified by this method? I guess.
Well, not totally sure I understand the question, but one of the ideas was of how we set this up was to use categories that were easily definable. So any lake in the coastal area would be a coastal lake. And if we have a maximum depth value for it, then it can be either a shallow lake or a deep lake.
So we could put any lake into whatever category if we knew where it was.
Yep.
And
no, we definitely had a certain number of lakes from each area with enough data to build the expected water quality thresholds with. So we don't have data on every lake, but we had I don't know the percentage of lakes within the coastal area that we had. But the idea is, so now if we do visit a lake for the first time and we have no background data on it, using this classification, we do have a little bit of context to put it in based on lakes of similar type that we do have data from.
So is there a list in that publication? Is there a list of the lakes that were used to build your model? Or
we have not published the list.
Okay.
I have it. It exists.
So if somebody wants it, would you tell them? Or
I would. Yeah. Like I mentioned, we're going to be working on some sort of public, whether it's internet-based or map-based or some kind of publication that's accessible to everybody, that will help people understand it better and use it for individual lake assessment or for whatever purpose they want it for. In that sense, we'll have lists and all that kind of stuff too.
Okay, there's definitely a lot of questions, people wanting to know about which lakes are in there. So I have a question. I'll sneak one of my questions in. In terms of, you mentioned the conductivity being, as a measure. Is the conductivity, I'm just curious, I've heard a lot and read a lot about road salts and the impacts of road salts and all this technology out there to reduce road salts in Maine. And this is a little bit off the topic, but it relates. Do we have any evidence of road salt impacts on lake conductivity? Like, are lakes with more roads around them potentially showing the effects of more road salt in winter?
Showing an effect, yes. We're not, to my knowledge, we're not seeing such a large increase that it's affecting other things that we're looking at.
Yeah.
There's been some research in the Adirondacks, which have a lot of lakes like Maine does, but they also have a lot of large paved roads going through the Adirondacks. And they're seeing that there's so much road salt being used in those lakes, it's affecting how the lakes are mixing, because they're so salty at the bottom that they're not mixing as they should be, because the water that's salty on bottom is too dense to mix to the top at some instances. So it's definitely having an effect there. We are lucky that we don't, well, it's not a matter of luck, but it's just the way it is. We don't have a lot of urban lakes.
Yeah.
So there are some lakes that have, paved roads and maintained roads along the lake shore or near enough that we've seen a measurable increase in conductivity since they started salting the roads.
Okay.
But we haven't seen, cascading effects from that yet.
Okay. Here's a question that I'm just going to read it because I can't really paraphrase this one. Does this data reflect not just effects of lake location and soils, down there, but also how previous and current development have already affected our lakes. If that is true, these aren't healthy goals, but current goals to try to maintain, with a question mark.
So one thing that doesn't really do is look at how lakes have changed over the years. So
Right.
what it does, it takes the watershed condition based on the most recent land cover classification from the Office of GIS, and a water quality average for the last 30 years or so. So it's more of a snapshot based approach. I'm interested to explore changes over time a little further now that we have the framework in place, but it was constructed based on, you know, averages and general condition for each lake.
Right.
So in answering how different lake types might respond to changes in their watershed, I don't really know that yet. I hope we can answer that someday.
Yeah. Okay. Have you found that alkaline northern lakes are more resilient to eutrophication?
Not necessarily, no. Usually the higher alkalinity lends itself to higher biological productivity as well. As we know, the soils up in that area, especially in the eastern where all the agriculture is, they're very fertile. And you know, what's good for plants on land is good for plants in the lake too. So with greater erosion of soils that have high nutrients and high alkalinity, that can lead to, you know, more biological productivity than low nutrient soils entering the lake.
Right. Okay. A couple more and then we'll let you go. Somebody asked for a link to the publication, so I'll get that from you and we'll send out a post webinar message by email to everybody, and we'll include that. So here's a good question. Well, it disappeared. It was a good question from Tony. Oh, I found it again. Will this classification be used more to determine overall lake health in each region over time versus giving us information about specific lakes?
We can certainly do both. I mean, I think this is fairly new and we haven't really explored, you know, everything that's possible with it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly something that we could do, is break it out by region and see how lakes are changing. The end part with the trends, where I show the different trends from each lake type, that's fairly new. And then I'd like to explore that a little more. We've done some work exploring why the trends are different for each of the lake types. And I'd like to continue to work on that and use data beyond the Secudus transparency and see, you know, see where the differences are and see if we can explain why we're seeing the differences that we do among the lake types. Okay,
great. Will Maine DEP be proposing to use the phosphorus thresholds from this approach to set nutrient criteria for Maine lakes?
I don't think so. No, I would argue against that, actually. I think what this does, it gives us context and gives us information and a way to evaluate lakes. But I think that, you know, the water quality standards we have for Maine are quite strong, and there's really not much of a reason to change them. So I don't.
Okay.
It's a good question, but I would not propose that it go that way. Yeah.
I'll end with this question. I know you and I have talked, and I think based on some of the questions here, I feel like people are just really not desperate people, but people really want information about their lake and how their lake is doing. And I know like lakesofmaine.org is a great resource that has a ton of information. It's not necessarily really easy to find unless, you know, someone calls you up and asks for guidance, or
Yeah.
calls me up, or you kind of have to know those data sets to understand them. So there's definitely been talk with Maine Lakes about sort of a scorecard, or a, not, I don't know, that's not quite the right word, but a report card, or a, something that gives you like a snapshot of information about lakes. So I'll let people know. I just wanted people to know that we're definitely thinking about that, and thinking how can we help in that process, because I think lake associations and others would, you know, that could be a really useful tool to get people more informed about their lakes and what needs to be done to keep them healthy. But I will just ask this one last question that kind of builds off of that, which is somebody asked, how do I best assess the quality of my lake? So is there anything that you can, any sort of, with anything you'd point someone to if they want to ask that question about their lake?
Well, I like you said, Lakes of Maine has the data. It can be a little tricky to navigate if it's your first time there, but give me a call or shoot me an email, and that's what I'm here for, is to help people get through the lake data and understand it. So so try Lakes of Maine. There's some good graphics there, and some lake reports that show the actual data and summarized data.
Yeah, and so
Susan, if we can get the scorecard thing, and we'll have the little graphs, little black stars, or some iteration of that, you know, in the context of the lake types.
So, and basically looking at Secchi disc will tell you, you know, if you look at Secchi disc, it's your water clarity, and if you look at phosphorus level,
so, okay, so yeah, the Secchi disc readings measure how clear the water is. So, you know, the more algae, the less clear it is. The less algae, the deeper you can see the disc. The bigger readings mean clearer water. And that's an important tool, because it has to do with how much is in the water. And algae.
So yeah, if you had to pick one thing to look at for your lake over time, that could potentially be one of the better measures. I mean, if I know that it doesn't answer everything, but
no, it doesn't. But it correlates to a lot of different. It correlates to different things. It correlates to how much phosphorus is in the lake. It correlates to how much chlorophyll, which we use to measure the amount of algae in the lake. It can measure the, you know, it's a good. It's like the doctor takes your temperature every time they see you, not because it tells them everything. It just kind of gives them a general assessment. It's like taking a look at the temperature. So it's good data to have, but it's not the only data you want.
Yeah. Well, and I'll add, because this is the beauty of Zoom, is Tristan Tabor just posted in the Q&A that they have a video on the Lakes of Maine website that acts as a guided tour to walk through, which I didn't know that was there. So thanks, Tristan, and that should help everybody if you want to get to lakesofmaine.org and start navigating around, look for that video. So with that, thanks. Oh, and Tristan put a link to that in the chat. So we'll make sure we copy that and send that out along with a link to your publication. So thank you. I think we got to most of the questions today, but if there's anything else, follow up directly with Jeremy. Jeremy, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to listen to your presentations and hear what you've been doing. And we thank you so much for.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.